20,000 head of cattle just died in the Castro County dairy farm explosion. Happened, was it yesterday or the day before? That's a lot of head of cattle, and this is a little outside the norm. Usually these food production facilities and farms spontaneously combust into fire or plane flies into them. Now they're just exploding. So I wanted to address something real quick before I get into this video, and that is that not every video I put out is going to be on a current news topic, because I think that too many YouTubers out there are becoming newscasters, and they talk about things that they don't have any knowledge of. The things that we choose to talk about on our channel are things that impact us, things that we have a lot of firsthand knowledge of, and we choose to stick to those topics and share them when we think that they're relevant. You know, not just sharing news stories to get views every single day. If you're just interested in As a Man Thinketh, we do have it as a playlist, a podcast playlist on our channel. And you can get all of the As a Man Thinkeths there. I do remove some of the old ones over time and just make them available to our Thinkers Club subscribers.
I mean, people go crazy at McDonald's because they get the kind of hamburger they wanted or something. It's going to be a lot different than it was Great Depression. They're going to be big problems.
But not every video I do is centered around hot topics. That's not the focus of our channel. And the focus of our channel is sharing, you know, rural life with everyday Americans so that people can start to understand why it's important to protect what it is we're trying to protect. Anyway, 20,000 head of cattle blown up. Luckily, there was only one person that was injured, and 20,000 head of cattle died. That's more cows that died in that one explosion than in what was reported in the Kansas heat wave, which was a pretty astronomical number back then. That was 10,000 head of cattle. So we just lost 20,000 head of dairy cows in one explosion. Cattle just keep dying and disappearing. I've done several videos on this on our channel. One of them I talked about the increase in tractor trailer incidents, and a lot of that could just be because of the increase in transporting cows, especially over the past year or so. We saw a lot of cows sent to slaughter, so there's been a lot of movement within the cattle industry. But cows also just keep disappearing or getting menaced by unknown things. I did a video on that as well. There were 80 head of cows that went disappearing from Colorado not too long ago without a trace. 80 head of cows without a trace. These thieves took them and didn't even leave a sign behind on how they got 80 head of cattle. And they struck again. The cattle thieves struck again actually recently in Kansas. I think they took another 80 head of cattle. Somebody has come up with the perfect trick of stealing 80 head of cattle from these areas. And it's only about 250 miles from where the last incident occurred. So these cows, you know, out there, somebody could travel that distance overnight and, you know, you wouldn't see your cows again. So another 80 head just gone missing without a trace. Police are looking for information. If you know anything, give them a call. Of course, if you watched my video on this before, I did bring up the Netflix documentary. Was it like Dark Skies or something like that? But there's some interesting things to consider there. Of course, while these stories are entertaining and interesting, and we could go back and forth with different theories all day long, the real story in the cattle industry right now, and the story that affects all of you, impacts all of you, is the massive cull of the U.S. herd between 2021 and 2022. On this channel, I have talked about this several times, and I have warned about what is going to happen to beef prices in the near future. And they are going to skyrocket. They already are. They're about to go up even higher. There's going to be a point in time where a lot of you cannot afford to buy beef. My suggestion would be, you know, before you go through this whole video, would be to just try and find a local farmer where you could buy a quarter or a half cow from, figure out a way to muster up the money now, buy that animal, put it in a freezer, and then kind of supplement your supply with what you're able to buy at the store on the sales shelf, because beef prices are about to go catastrophically high, higher than we've ever seen before. Normally you see these type of price swings every 10 years or so. In 2014, 2015, we saw a big price increase in beef. Ironically, that was also due to a drought. So these 10-year swings in beef prices tend to follow 10-year swings in droughts. A lot of you probably thought that droughts were caused by CO2, but that's not actually the case. You see, droughts occur in intervals, and we can see those intervals in the cattle market because they seem to occur every 10 or 11 years. And that's because we have a La Nina cycle, a more severe La Nina cycle, every 10 to 11 years. La Ninas, I think I did a video on this a while back, but La Ninas, there's a 99% chance of having a La Nina after a termination event in the solar cycle. What that means is that, you have a solar cycle, it goes up for a period of time, total solar irradiance, and then it drops down. That's the activity of the sun. That goes up, comes down. As it somewhere down at solar minimum, it goes through a termination and starts a new cycle. And almost 99.9% of the time, there was a study on this, that triggers a La Nina cycle. And then depending, of course, on total solar activity and things like that, it could have a dramatic impact on how many La Ninas we actually end up seeing, whether we see 1, 2, or in this past year's case, 3. So no, cattle aren't the death of themselves. They aren't causing the heat waves and droughts because they're burping out a bunch of methane and causing global warming. This is actually a cycle that occurs, and you see it in beef prices. But this time I think it's going to be dramatically different. And the reason is, number one, the La Nina cycle was significantly more severe and the drought was more severe than it was back in 2014, 2015. The other reason is that we've culled so much of our herd and the demand for beef has gone way up. So to put this in perspective, if you look at cattle going on feed numbers, they're the lowest that we've seen since the 1960s. But if you look at that demand curve for beef over that period of time, demand has gone significantly higher. So our supply to demand gap, that gap that drives price up, is substantially wider than it ever has been. It's substantially wider than it was in 2014, 2015, and it's certainly a lot wider than it was back when we were at these low levels of inventory back in the 1960s. So what we're facing right now is a much bigger challenge. The only reason why consumers have not paid for that price is because of the exorbitant amount of culling we did last year. We started off the year with a significant amount of cold storage. And we still weren't seeing a huge drop in slaughterhouse numbers at the beginning of the year in January. But as we've gotten into February, March, April, what we've seen is a dramatic drop in numbers that are actually going up for sale in the sale barns. Obviously, that's impacting fed cattle prices. Fed cattle prices are hitting new records right now. And I think that we're only at the beginning of the cycle. That's what makes part of this a little scary for the consumer. And honestly, if you're a rancher, you should be concerned about this, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But it's going to make things a little scary for the consumer when they go to the store and they see that, back in 2019, they were paying X amount, and now they're paying X amount more. And a lot of that is because the price of these carcasses is going, or live weights are going for a lot more. So by the time you butcher that down and you get beef out of it, you're paying a significant amount more for each of those steaks, each of those burgers. So as the cold storage supply diminishes and we move on to more fresh beef, you're going to see these prices go up because they're already going up. They've been going up in the background for some time. We normally always see, when it comes to beef prices, kind of seasonal trends, right? You kind of go up until about now, and then you'll kind of head down through the summertime as far as beef prices are concerned. And then, live cattle weights. And then you tend to go back up again as you get into the next winter. You see these kind of trends that form each year. But since 2021 and 2022, we've only seen the prices go up on live cattle weights for fed cattle. We've only seen the prices go up. That should disturb you because in 2021 and 2022, we were culling at an astronomical rate. We culled the most cattle and beef production was at its highest in 2022. So the fact that prices continued to stay on an upward trend throughout the entire year is highly unusual, and that's expected to continue into 2023. I suspect it'll continue until 2025. So we're going to continue to see these prices continue to go up. And unfortunately, I think the shock will come to the consumer as the cold storage from 2022 goes away and they start having to pay for what beef is actually going for, what the cows are actually going for, because it is substantially higher. We're paying a lot more. There are other factors that are going to get into the consumer. I was going to address this later, but I might as well address it now. A big factor is that in 2014 and 2015, when we saw these price spikes, we didn't have as impactful global trade with U.S. beef as we do now. And what we've seen lately is a lot of countries around the world wanting to get away from the dollar king. The dollar king, or the U.S. dollar, has basically been the basis of commodity trade around the world for a very long time, for generations. And the reason for that is because it was a trustworthy currency. We could all trust in the American dollar, right? And all of these fiat currencies, they do not exist without trust. Once that trust is broken, there's nothing backing them. They're just pieces of paper with numbers on them. There is absolutely nothing backing a dollar bill or any currency for that matter other than trust. Now there is a new BRICS currency that they've been working on that would actually be backed by gold and like the economies of numerous different countries. I think that could actually be a much stronger currency that should scare the pants off of you. But the US dollar is completely being disowned by countries around the world. And the reason why it's being disowned by even the French, I mean, Macron or whatever that guy's name is, was out there the other day saying that all of Europe should move away from the US dollar for safety. What happened is, number one, we printed way too much of it. If you just put an infinite supply of a dollar bill out there, it's going to lose value because nobody trusts the value of it. It could just be printed and made more of. It's just like if you had a ton of beef on the market, since we're talking about beef, if there's too much beef on the market, it drives prices down. If there's too many dollars on the market, it drives the value of the dollar down. So people are losing value in the dollar by, holding on to it because it's just dropping in value constantly. The more we print, the more it drops in value. But the other problem, and this is more significant than that, which I didn't think that there could ever be an event that was more significant than that, but more significant than the drop in the value of the dollar due to excessive printing and spending, people around the world, countries around the world have lost trust in the US dollar, in the United States currency, because we weaponize it. If you want to have a global currency that is trusted and utilized around the world, making your economy the strongest in the world because it's your currency, you would have to have a system of trust, have a system in place that no matter what, people could rely on that dollar. And what we have done is we've gone to countries that we disagree with, and in some cases, I'm sure we have good reasons for disagreeing with them, but we've gone to countries that we disagree with, and we've used that king dollar system to punish them. We've put sanctions on them. We've figured out ways to shut them down. And by doing that, by weaponizing the dollar, we have effectively lost the trust of the world trade system and commodities in the US dollar. No longer can anybody trust that the US dollar is a stable dollar. It could be used as a weapon against them. And so everybody is running from the dollar like there's no tomorrow. Simply put, those decisions that we have made have financially screwed the American public, because here's what's going to happen now. That dollar has absolutely no value. We've printed way too much of it. All those dollars that have been held by other countries around the world to buy commodities and trade are going to find their way back to the US, which is basically going to bring truckloads of dollars to the US. We've all talked about the Weimar Republic. I did a video on where I thought we were heading a couple of years ago before the last election, and I talked about all of these things taking place. And I don't know if you guys watched that video, but you should definitely go and watch it now, because if you watch what I was saying back then and you look at where we are now, that's where we're headed. But all of these dollars that have been overseas, held by other countries, are going to find their way back here. China's been selling their dollar holdings at an alarming rate. and they've been buying gold at an alarming rate. Of course, China is preparing to go to war with the U.S., so they don't want to hold any U.S. treasuries when that happens. They're actually staging out and planning blockades of Taiwan, and when that happens, we'll go to war with them. But other countries as well are dropping the dollar at alarming rates. It's going to be valueless by the time it all gets back here. I mean, it'll take you a wheelbarrow to go buy a loaf of bread. So when it comes to the consumer seeing a supply shortage of something like meat or protein, it's only going to get even worse as the dollar crisis unfolds, and it's unfolding pretty fast. This is a run on the dollar like we have not seen in our lifetime. And because of that, it has some strength. In the past, you could say, oh, they want to get away from the dollar. Nobody's successfully done it. But when you have kind of the widespread, we're leaving the dollar system going on, it's going to happen. I mean, there's no stopping it at this point in time, right? We've already ruined it. It's kind of like, using our justice system to go after opponents that we don't like. After a period of time, the justice system is just going to collapse because nobody's going to have faith in it. Nobody's going to trust it anymore. Now, these price increases for cattlemen and farmers, ranchers, they seem pretty good. And without the price increases, I don't see how they would make it because the cost of feed is going through the roof. We've had the worst year for wheat that we've seen in a very long time in the U.S. Obviously, Ukraine is going to be putting out 35% less wheat production because we're going off of last year's crop. They produced 35% less. We already know that that's going to be majorly impacted. The grain markets around the world have been turned upside down, and they're only getting worse. They've been getting worse for the last couple of years. I mean, hopefully, maybe we could have a decent year with our corn crop here in the United States, but it's going to take more than 1 year to get us back on track, and our stocks, ending stocks, are going to continue to drop until we could actually figure out a way to get back up on top of the grain storage. And so grains are going to continue to go up. So prices going up on beef cattle is good in that regard, and good in general because, farmers have never been paid what the value is actually worth. And so to see prices go up, that's exciting. But there are some significant dangers that I see happening in the industry right now that everybody should be paying attention to. The first danger is with the decrease in inventories, we're going to see a dramatic decrease in sale barn activity. I've heard numbers over 30%. Over a 30% decrease in sale barn activity. And that, I think, is going to last for 2 years, 2023, 2024. Of course, 2024, you won't see a decrease. It'll just remain at low levels. The problem with this is that there aren't going to be a lot of sale barns that can stay in business. So you're going to see a massive consolidation. And anytime we see a consolidation in an industry, we see a power grab. Somebody's going to grab that power. Farmers are constantly complaining that they're getting underhanded at sale barns. Imagine what will happen when we consolidate those sale barns and there's less of them. That's going to happen on a much larger scale. So that's the big problem. And I think industry consolidation in the cattle markets is coming. It's being forced upon us, whether we like it or not. You're going to see more regulations over the next couple years coming out that are going to impact you. One of those regulations is coming right now in the U.S. with over-the-counter medications for antibiotics. In the past, a farmer or a rancher could offer their cows affordable health care by going to a place like Tractor Supply or their local farm supply and buying the necessary medical supplies that they needed for their cows. But the new FDA ruling says you can't do that. You have to have a prescription from a veterinarian. That's going to put a lot of small farmers out of business by design. And I think that that's going to have a substantial impact on the market moving forward. For larger producers, for the big ranches, it's not going to have that much of an impact because a lot of them are already using veterinarians. When you're running several hundred head of cows through a chute in one day, it's a lot more economical to hire a veterinarian than it is when you're only running maybe 5 to 10. The cost goes significantly up, especially when you figure out the costs of the veterinarian just coming to the farm. So this is a ruling that is triggering the demise of small farmers, not big farmers. Big farmers and ranchers really don't have to worry that much about it. There is another thing thing that we see happening in Europe right now. Some of the governments have been implementing rules that farmers have to put additives into their cattle feed that reduce methane emissions from cows. You know, it's funny, we used to have millions upon millions, 60 million plus bison running across the Great Plains, millions of other ruminants like elk and, you know, deer and antelope, just all over the earth before we wiped them all out. They put off way more methane than CO2 than anything else. But for whatever reason, now that we're driving cars and everything else, we're just going to blame it all on them. But that's basically what's happening, and they're forcing farmers to feed additives in with their feed that reduce methane. I can't imagine that altering the animal's body in this kind of way is good for them. I mean, I know how I feel when I get stopped up with a little too much gas. But this is basically kind of the direction that we're going in there. It's going to increase feed costs, which is going to put small farmers out of business. This has been the plan for quite some time over there in Europe. We've seen it happen with the Dutch farmers. I mean, they've flat out said we're going to be putting these small farmers out of business. And I think that that's going to happen here in the US as well. When it comes to regulations from federal agencies, the FDA, the EPA, the Biden administration has found them to be effective tools for passing executive orders that don't have to go through Congress for a vote. This is essentially the best way to do away with democracy and come up with your own agenda. For example, they couldn't ban gas stoves. That would have to go in front of Congress for a vote. So what they did was they came out with regulations that just basically made 85 to 90% of all the gas stoves on the market banned. So you can't buy them. So now you have to go with the really, really expensive ones or cheap electric. They did the same thing with light bulbs. You know, they're passing a ban on retailers selling incandescent bulbs. Now this can all be done through, you know, the EPA, energy efficiency. You don't have to have a vote on it. But what happens is that people can't afford anything but incandescent bulbs. I mean, have you tried paying for an LED light switch, or have you even tried paying for LED bulbs to put all LED bulbs in your house? They're significantly more expensive than incandescent bulbs. The switches are substantially more expensive than the incandescent bulb switches. So, but again, they were able to do that through executive order. It doesn't matter. You don't have a say in it. The Congress doesn't have a say in it. And mind you, these are the same agencies that are like, hey, go back home to your house in Palestine, Ohio. It's good for you. There's another one that they're about to come out with, and that is by 2050 or something like that, 80 to 90% or 60%, I don't know what it is. It's a high number. It's up there. That's what it is. The auto manufacturers have to have a 65 mile per gallon ratio for their entire fleet. So they would consider an electric car 100 miles per gallon. And probably the best we could do right now is where we are with gas-powered vehicles. You get some like the Honda that get 35 miles per gallon. But for the most part, we've kind of maxed out what we can do as far as making vehicles fuel efficient. So in order to close that 35 mile per gallon gap with that 100 mile per gallon gap to hit 65, what they're going to have to do is increase electric car production or decrease the combustible engine production along the line to average their fleet out, their yearly fleet out. And so essentially what's going to happen is the replacements for gas-powered vehicles are simply going to disappear. So we couldn't vote on it to say, we don't want them anymore. So what we're doing is we're just changing a regulation to force people out of business and force people out of the financial ability to buy a car. So regulations, I think, are a big thing that's going to be hitting farmers in the near future, especially cattle ranchers. And I would look at everything that's being done in Europe and just think about it being implemented here within 2 to 3 years, because it's going to happen. It may even happen sooner than that. The other thing that I think that ranchers and farmers need to pay attention to is what happened in Australia. Because what happened in Australia had a devastating impact on the market, has put more farmers out of business than the Australian drought itself. And that is this. Australia went through a drought before we did, right? We all knew about that. They culled a ton of cows, ton of dairy cows, and it was a massive cull, just like we saw here in the United States. We can learn from other countries that have already gone through something in modern day by watching what happened there. And I would suggest everybody watch what happens in Australia, because then what happened is they went back into a herd rebuilding phase. Of course, their herd numbers were very low, so their cattle prices had gone through the roof, kind of like what we're seeing right now. And like I said, I expect this to continue at least through 2024. We're going to continue to see these prices go up. The consumer is going to start feeling them more so than they have with most of this increase, because we're going to run out of those cold supplies. But I think it's safe to say that prices will continue up. The problem is when the correction comes. When the correction comes, you're looking at roughly a 33% correction. That's the typical Fibonacci curve, right? So you're going to see this massive correction. And what has happened in Australia is that fed cattle are going for an exorbitant loss compared to the costs that the farmers have paid to buy the cows, to rebuild their herds, and then feed them. So they're just losing money left and right now. So for small farmers, I would suggest finding a way to vertically integrate, even if that means you have to go out and lease some land somewhere, but vertically integrate your business model. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of folks out there who just do a feeder cattle operation. They'll go and they'll buy feeder cows from the sale yard, the auction barn, and they'll rent them on their property, fatten them up over the course of a year and a half, then they'll sell them. And that's generally how you can make some very decent money in the cattle business on stable years. But what we're seeing are unstable years. What we're seeing in Australia is people getting burned on that model. So by vertically integrating, if you ran a cow-calf operation, number one, you could take advantage of some of the prices, the higher prices being put out there for bred calves or bred cows and calves as they go onto the market, because those prices are going up. It's not just the fed prices that are going up. So you could take advantage of those prices, or you could use that to help replenish your feeder cattle so that your investment cost is a little lower. And I realize that there's an investment cost in raising a cow-calf operation. And those who have vertically integrated even above that, get out of the wholesale barn system and market your own meat and sell direct to consumer, they're actually, they may not have as many cows that they're processing each year, but instead of getting, $1,700 a head, they're getting $5,000, $6,000 a head because they're doing direct sale marketing. And that is another way of making a substantial amount of money off of your smaller operation without having to get bigger, right? Because you don't have to get bigger, you're actually getting smaller a little bit. You're starting to run those cow-calf pairs, you're raising your calves up to the point of slaughter, so you have less, but then you're doing direct marketing to the consumer, so you're getting a lot more per pound than you would in a sale barn. So that is a way that smaller farmers could handle this thing. And like I said, for consumers, I'd seek out your local farmer, your local rancher. I'd figure out what it's going to take you to get a quarter cow, half cow, if you can manage it, a full cow in your freezer. And don't go through that. Don't just put it in there and say, this is going to be my meat for the next 6 months. Put it in there because the meat prices are going to continue to go up substantially. Take advantage of the sales at the store, and then, offset that, supplement yourself with what you have in the freezer. That'll bring your cost ratio way down. So things are about to get pretty dicey out there, especially in the beef industry. This is going to have a rollover impact in pork, chicken, everything else. And I'll do other videos on that as time goes by. We've been pretty busy lately, so I try and do these videos as often as I can. I know some of you just enjoy listening to these As a Man Thinketh. I do have a podcast playlist for this series, so if you are just interested in those videos, you could just check those videos out. But we do have a lot of other interesting content on this channel, and don't forget that part of what we're doing when we're going out there and being a part of this community is we're learning about these systems, we're learning about these things, and it's giving us the knowledge to correctly share that with you, or sometimes incorrectly. I mean, I'm not saying I'm always correct, but we're building that knowledge and we're bringing that back to you guys. People who just read news articles and report on anything newsworthy that comes out every single day to get views aren't necessarily giving you anything with substantial background or real life knowledge.